A billionaire's wife mocked her maid's accent, called her uneducated, and treated her with cruelty. She never imagined fate's revenge. Years later, the maid rose as a billionaire, while the fallen wife returned, desperate and begging for a job. Chicago, with its tall glass towers and crowded streets, was a city where dreams could rise as quickly as they could fall. In one corner of this city stood a grand mansion, a symbol of wealth and power. Inside lived Margaret, a woman in her mid-40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. She was married to a billionaire businessman whose empire stretched across industries, and together they lived a life many could only imagine. Yet, behind the polished walls of the mansion, Margaret revealed a different side, one that was not defined by elegance but by pride and sharp words. Working in that mansion was Elena, a young woman in her late 20s. She had come to the United States with hope in her heart and only a little money in her pocket. Elena was not born into wealth. She had grown up in a modest family overseas, where opportunities were scarce. With determination, she crossed oceans to build a new life in America, and she found work as a maid in Margaret's household. Elena was quiet, hardworking, and respectful. Her accent carried traces of her homeland, and though she spoke with effort, her words often became the target of Margaret's cruel remarks. From the first day, Margaret looked down on her. "Your words are heavy, broken. People will think you are uneducated," she once said with a sneer while Elena polished the silverware. On other days, Margaret would mock her clothing or her silence, believing that the absence of wealth meant the absence of intelligence. To Margaret, Elena was only a servant, invisible except for the tasks she performed. But Elena listened, nodded, and kept her dignity intact. She understood that her life could not be measured by Margaret's harsh opinions. Every evening, when the day's duties were done and the mansion grew quiet, Elena returned to her small rented room. She would sit at her desk, her hands tired from cleaning floors and carrying laundry, and open her books. She had enrolled in night classes at a local community college, studying the basics of business. Balancing both work and study was not easy. Sometimes she barely slept, rising before dawn to prepare for another day at the mansion. Yet she carried on, driven by the belief that her life could be more than the role she was forced into. Elena saved money quietly, placing small amounts aside from each paycheck. She avoided unnecessary expenses, cooking simple meals and wearing the same clothes until they were worn. Each dollar saved brought her closer to her dream. Though she faced exhaustion and loneliness, she refused to let despair take hold. She knew hardship, but she also knew resilience. The contrast between the two women grew sharper with time. Margaret's life was filled with luxury. She hosted parties where music echoed through the halls and laughter spilled across golden chandeliers. Guests admired her diamonds, her gowns, her position. Elena often stood on the edges of these gatherings, unnoticed, serving drinks or clearing plates while listening to the conversations of wealth and privilege. At times, she wondered if she truly belonged in this city where power seemed to rest only in the hands of the rich. Yet deep down, she reminded herself that dignity did not come from jewels or mansions. It came from the choices a person made and the way they treated others. One evening, Margaret criticized her more harshly than usual. "You will never rise above scrubbing floors," she said sharply, laughing with a friend as Elena stood nearby. The words stung, but Elena kept her composure. She lowered her eyes, finished her work, and quietly left the room. In her heart, those words became fuel. She promised herself she would not remain in that position forever. Over the years, Elena's patience and persistence began to open doors. She completed her studies and, with the knowledge she gained, planned something of her own. With the money she had saved, she started a small cleaning company. At first, it was only a few clients, offices that needed regular cleaning, and small contracts that barely covered costs. She hired others who, like her, were searching for opportunities. People often overlooked people who understood hard work. Her reputation for honesty and careful service spread. Word of mouth brought more clients, and soon her company began to grow. Elena reinvested every profit into expanding, buying supplies, and hiring more staff. She treated her employees with fairness and respect, remembering what it felt like to be dismissed and belittled. By her mid-30s, she had built a company that reached across Chicago, serving hotels, offices, and even wealthy estates. She was no longer the maid in the corner of a mansion but a leader guiding her own enterprise. Meanwhile, Margaret's world remained untouched by struggle. She continued to live surrounded by luxury, never imagining her life could change. Her husband's empire seemed unshakable, built on foundations of wealth and influence. She never thought to prepare for loss, never believed her status could fade. She lived as if fortune would always be at her side. But time has a way of shifting ground beneath the proud. In the world of wealth, markets rise and fall, and empires that seem eternal can collapse overnight. While Elena's star was slowly rising, cracks began to appear in Margaret's perfect world. Cracks that would grow deeper with each passing year. As Chicago moved forward, two women walked very different paths. One carried her pride like armor, certain her power would last forever. The other carried her hope like a quiet flame, nurturing it in the shadows until it grew strong enough to light her way. Their lives, once tied by the walls of a mansion, would soon collide again, but under circumstances neither of them could have predicted. And so the city waited. In the noise of traffic, the rush of business, and the whispers of ambition, the stage was being set. Two women, once separated by wealth and arrogance, would soon meet again, not as mistress and maid but as equals on very different sides of fortune. What lay ahead was a test of character, a revelation of true strength, and a moment that would change both their lives forever. The years rolled on, and the rhythm of Chicago never slowed. Elena's company kept spreading through the city, quietly but steadily. Her clients appreciated not just the quality of the work but the honesty and reliability she and her employees brought. She was no longer the girl mocked for her accent or dismissed as uneducated. She was now a respected businesswoman, the head of a growing company with a reputation built on trust. Yet, Elena never let success change her core. She remembered her beginnings, the long nights of studying after endless shifts, the sting of Margaret's harsh words, and the silence she had to swallow each time she was treated as invisible. Those memories kept her grounded. At the same time, Margaret's life was beginning to take a very different shape. On the surface, things seemed unchanged. The mansion still glittered with parties, the guests still admired her clothing, and the cars still lined the driveway. But beneath that image, her husband's empire was starting to weaken. Business decisions that once seemed flawless began to falter. Markets shifted, and competitors gained ground. Slowly at first, then more rapidly the cracks widened. Margaret, however, was blind to these changes. She lived as though wealth was permanent, as though status could never be taken away. She continued to treat those around her with arrogance, believing nothing could touch her. Even as her husband grew quieter at the dinner table, staring at numbers and figures that didn't add up, Margaret dismissed his concerns. She didn't see the storm coming. The crash, when it arrived, was swift and brutal. In a matter of months, investments failed, companies folded, and debts surfaced. The empire collapsed under its own weight. Lawyers, creditors, and banks circled like hawks, demanding what was owed. The mansion, once filled with laughter and guests, grew cold as the reality of loss set in. The luxury cars disappeared, the jewels were sold, and the endless flow of money dried up. Margaret could not believe it. The life she thought was unshakable crumbled in her hands. She moved from denial to panic, and then to anger. But none of those emotions could restore what was gone. The once powerful billionaire family had become ordinary, stripped of its wealth and influence. For the first time in her life, Margaret was forced to confront survival in a way she never imagined. The servants were gone. The mansion was sold. Bills piled up. She had to find work, but she had no real skills outside of hosting parties and managing appearances. Her husband, once admired for his empire, fell into silence and despair, unable to rebuild from the ruins. Margaret's pride clashed with her desperation. At first, she resisted the idea of taking a job. To her, it felt like humiliation. But as days turned into weeks, and her savings dwindled, she realized she had no choice. She needed to provide for herself to keep going somehow. The woman who had once mocked others for their lack of education now searched for work with no qualifications to offer. She applied here and there, to places she never would have stepped into before. Offices, small businesses, and shops. But rejection followed her. Her name no longer carried weight, and her lack of experience closed doors. She felt the sting of being dismissed, the very sting she had once inflicted on others. In the middle of the search, Margaret came across a company name that caught her eye. It was a cleaning company, one she had heard whispered about in her social circles, though she had never paid it much attention before. The company had a reputation for professionalism, and it was said to be expanding quickly. Desperation overpowered hesitation, and she filled out an application. Margaret walked into the office on a bright morning, dressed in the best clothes she still owned. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would present herself, clinging to the fragments of her old pride. She told herself that work was work, and she would do what was needed. What she did not know was that this company was Elena's. The same Elena she had once mocked and dismissed in her mansion years ago. Elena was now the CEO, sitting behind the desk of a company that had become her own empire, built not on arrogance but on resilience and effort. Margaret entered the office with her head held high, expecting to meet a manager or recruiter. Instead, she found herself face to face with Elena. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Margaret's eyes widened, and her voice faltered. She had walked into the one place she never expected to be, and the one person she never expected to see stood before her, not as a maid but as a leader. Elena looked at her calmly. Years had passed, and she carried herself with quiet authority. She had grown into her role, and the strength she once held silently now shone openly. She remembered the mansion, the sharp words, the laughter at her expense. But she also remembered her promise to herself, that she would rise, not through anger, but through perseverance. Margaret struggled to speak. Her pride clashed with her desperation, and for the first time, she could not hide behind arrogance. She was no longer the woman in control. She was the one asking for help. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with unspoken memories. Elena did not gloat. She did not remind Margaret of the past. Instead, she listened quietly, allowing Margaret to explain herself. Margaret's words came out uneven, full of hesitation. She admitted she was looking for work, that she needed stability. The woman who once looked down on Elena now stood before her in need. It was a moment of revelation for both of them. For Margaret, it was the shock of seeing the roles reversed, realizing the fragility of wealth and status. For Elena, it was the test of her own character, whether to return cruelty with cruelty or to rise above it. The city outside carried on as usual, unaware of the quiet storm inside that office. Two women, once bound by the walls of a mansion, stood face to face again, but in a world completely changed. The balance of power had shifted, and what would happen next hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she waited for Elena's response. Elena leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady, her mind weighing the past against the present. The silence stretched, and with it, the suspense of what choice she would make. The office was quiet, and the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Margaret stood stiffly, unsure if she should sit or remain standing. She had never felt so small in her life. Years ago, she had held the power in their relationship, speaking down to Elena as if she were invisible. Now she stood in Elena's office, asking for something she once believed she would never need: mercy. Elena's eyes lingered on Margaret, but her expression gave nothing away. She could see the lines of stress on Margaret's face, the tiredness in her eyes, and the desperation she tried to mask with forced pride. For a moment, Elena thought back to those nights when Margaret's words had cut into her, calling her uneducated, mocking her accent. She remembered standing in the corner of the mansion while laughter filled the room at her expense. It would have been easy, almost satisfying, to turn Margaret away, to give her a taste of the same humiliation. But Elena had never built her life on bitterness. "Please sit," Elena finally said, her voice calm and steady. Margaret hesitated before lowering herself into the chair opposite the desk. The shift in roles was unmistakable. Margaret was no longer the woman commanding a household, but a person sitting nervously before someone she had underestimated. I don't know if you remember me," Margaret began, her words heavy. She attempted to keep her tone even, but it trembled slightly. "Things have changed. My husband's business, we lost everything. I need work. Any work." Elena listened, her face composed. She remembered everything, but she did not interrupt. Margaret continued, each word sounding like it took effort to say. "I never thought I'd be in this position, but here I am. If there's a place for me here, I would be grateful." The silence that followed was thick. Margaret's pride fought against her need, and Elena could see the conflict written across her face. For someone who had once believed herself untouchable, asking for help was almost unbearable. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "I remember you, Margaret. I remember every word you spoke to me in that house." Margaret's eyes dropped to the floor. She could not meet Elena's gaze. "But I also remember the promise I made to myself, that I would rise above it." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands tightening in her lap. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly. "I treated you terribly. I see that now." The words seemed to burn as they left her mouth, but they were the truth she could no longer deny. Elena studied her, trying to decide what this moment meant. She could choose revenge, remind Margaret of every cruelty, and send her away. But deep inside, Elena knew that would not bring her peace. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and built her life on resilience and character. If she sank to the level of cruelty, she would lose what made her strong. "I built this company from the ground up," Elena said, her tone steady. "I know what it feels like to start with nothing. I won't turn you away, Margaret. If you are willing to work, there is a place for you here." Margaret's head lifted, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had expected rejection, maybe even humiliation. Instead, she was being offered kindness, the very thing she had never shown Elena. For a moment, she could not find her voice. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Elena nodded, though she kept her expression calm. "This won't be easy. You'll start like everyone else with no special treatment. You'll learn the work from the ground level." Margaret stiffened slightly. The idea of starting from the bottom was foreign to her, but she knew she had no choice. "I understand," she said quietly. Their conversation ended with instructions for Margaret to begin training the next week. As she left the office, her thoughts were a storm. The pride that had once defined her was wounded, but so was her sense of certainty. She realized that the woman she had dismissed as a servant had built an empire stronger than the one her husband had lost. Elena sat at her desk after Margaret left, reflecting on what had just happened. The years of endurance, the long nights of studying, the sacrifices, this was the result. But she felt no triumph in Margaret's downfall. Instead, she felt a strange mix of sadness and strength. Margaret's life was a lesson in what pride could destroy, while her own journey was proof of what resilience could create. Days later, Margaret began her new role. She was assigned basic cleaning tasks, dusting, mopping, organizing supplies. It was the kind of work she had once overlooked, the kind of work Elena had done quietly in her mansion. At first, Margaret struggled. The physical effort left her exhausted, and her pride made it hard to accept instructions from others. Some employees recognized her name and whispered, but Elena had made it clear. Margaret was to be treated like any other worker. Margaret's first weeks were humbling. She realized how much she had relied on others her entire life, never understanding the labor that kept her world running. She began to see the dignity in hard work, the quiet pride of earning something through effort rather than status. Elena watched from a distance, never interfering more than necessary. She gave Margaret the space to adjust, to learn, to grow. She knew the lesson was not in words but in experience. Margaret had to face the reality of humility, just as Elena once faced the sting of arrogance. Yet beneath the routine, tension lingered. Margaret often wondered why Elena had shown her mercy. Was it pity? Was it a lesson in disguise? The uncertainty gnawed at her, keeping her restless at night. And Elena, though calm on the surface, felt the weight of Margaret's presence in her company. The past had not disappeared, and though she had chosen compassion, the memory of old wounds still lived quietly within her. As the weeks turned into months, the city outside kept moving, unaware of the strange reversal unfolding inside Elena's company. Two women who once stood on opposite ends of fortune were now tied together again, but in roles neither had imagined. Margaret worked quietly, while Elena led with strength. And though they had reached this fragile balance, something still hung in the air, an unspoken tension, a question of how long this uneasy peace could last. Neither of them could fully see the path ahead, but both knew it was far from finished. The story between them was not over, and the final test of character was still waiting beyond the horizon. Margaret's days at the company slowly turned into a routine. She arrived early, wearing simple clothes now instead of tailored dresses. She learned to handle mops, vacuum cleaners, and supply lists. Every task felt heavy at first, a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. Yet, as weeks passed, her hands grew steadier, and her movements more natural. She began to understand what it meant to labor for each paycheck. Though her pride still whispered, she was learning, slowly, the value of humility. For Elena, the presence of Margaret was a test that stretched on. She never let her authority slip, and she treated Margaret as she did every employee. Fairly but firmly. She didn't mock, didn't remind, didn't use her position for revenge. But each time she saw Margaret scrubbing a floor or following instructions, she was reminded of her own years in the mansion, when Margaret's sharp words echoed in her ears. Elena wondered if true forgiveness was possible, or if some scars simply became part of who you are. The staff at the company adjusted quickly. Many of them respected Elena deeply, not just as their boss but as a woman who treated them with dignity. They noticed Margaret's struggle and often exchanged glances, whispering about how strange it was to see a woman who once lived in luxury now cleaning alongside them. Some were tempted to mock her, but they followed Elena's example. They kept their distance, working alongside Margaret without cruelty. Margaret herself felt the weight of that silence. She had once walked into rooms expecting attention and admiration. Now she entered unnoticed, one of many workers blending into the background. At times, she felt the sting of shame, but she pressed on. She told herself that work was better than despair, and survival was worth any humiliation. One late evening, Margaret stayed behind to finish cleaning an office. The building was quiet, the hum of machines filling the empty space. As she wiped down a desk, she paused, looking at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak aloud what had been pressing in her heart. "I was cruel," she whispered. "I thought I was untouchable, and now here I am." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of truth. Elena happened to be leaving her office that night and overheard Margaret's voice. She didn't step in, didn't make her presence known, but the moment stayed with her. It told her that Margaret was beginning to face herself, to see clearly what pride had cost her. Months passed and Margaret grew more capable. She learned to take pride in completing tasks well, to find rhythm in work she once thought beneath her. She began to understand her fellow workers, to share small conversations during breaks. For the first time in her life, she experienced a kind of equality she had never known. She was no longer the mistress of a mansion but a woman among others, standing on the same ground. One day, Elena called Margaret into her office. The air felt heavy, the way it had on the first day they met again, but this time Margaret's posture was different. She no longer tried to hold herself above anyone. She walked in quietly, waiting to hear what Elena had to say. "You've been here for some time now," Elena said. "I've watched your progress. You're learning, Margaret. Not just the work, but something more important." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I've had no choice but to learn," she admitted. "Life, it stripped everything away, and I see now how blind I was. I mocked you, treated you with disrespect, And yet you gave me a chance when you didn't have to. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't know if I'll ever deserve that. Elena studied her carefully. She could see the truth in Margaret's words, the shift that had taken place. For years, Elena had carried the memory of cruelty like a weight, but now she saw what it had become, a lesson. She understood that her strength was not only in rising above hardship, but in choosing kindness even when cruelty would be easier. You don't owe me words, Elena said softly. You owe yourself change. What you do with this chance is up to you. But remember, character is not built when life is easy. It shows itself when everything else is gone. Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. For the first time in her life, she felt not only humbled but grateful. She realized that Elena's strength came not from money or power but from something deeper, an unshakable core of dignity and compassion. Outside the office, the city of Chicago carried on as always. The streets were busy, the buildings tall, the world moving forward. Inside, however, a quiet transformation had taken place. Margaret, once defined by arrogance, had been forced to see the fragility of her pride. Elena, once dismissed as a maid, had proven that resilience and kindness carried more power than wealth ever could. Yet, even as the two women reached this moment of clarity, a sense of suspense lingered. Life was unpredictable, as both of them had learned. The future was unwritten, and no one could say what trials or changes still lay ahead. But what was certain was this. Their story was no longer one of mistress and servant, nor of revenge and defeat. It was a story of resilience tested, of pride broken, and of kindness chosen when cruelty seemed easier. Margaret left the office that day with her steps slower but her heart lighter. She understood that humility was not weakness but a new kind of strength. Elena watched her go, knowing she had made the harder choice, the one that spoke of true character. And in the quiet that followed, both women carried forward the lessons life had carved into them. Proof that fortunes can vanish, power can crumble, but the measure of a person endures in how they rise, how they endure, and how they choose to treat others when the balance of power shifts. The city outside roared on, unaware of the silent shift inside that small office. Two women, bound by a past of cruelty and survival, had faced the test of character. One had fallen and begun to rebuild, the other had risen and chosen compassion. And though the chapter closed with a fragile peace, the suspense of what life might bring next lingered like a question in the air, reminding them both that the story of human strength never truly ends.